Good morning everyone, and welcome to my first Facebook live streaming event in which I'll be reading some excerpts from my book and as well as sharing some exciting news. As you're probably aware, I released my first book, Unbutchered, Dehumanising a Plastic Surgeon, in February this year, and it was met with a favourable response. I recently released my second book in the series, Fish Rots from the Head Down, exposing HPCSA corruption, and I'm very happy with the sales at the moment. I decided to do a launch of both books and was looking for a venue to launch the book and do a book signing. Now, unfortunately, Benoni Country Club was too busy and I was unable to get there, but I spoke to Rod Skeepers from Benoni Northerns and he was quite happy to provide me with a venue. I'm down to do a launch and book signing next week, the 7th of December at 6:30 until about 8. Now, here's an interesting story. I had a poster printed, one of those large posters, and I placed it in the passage of the door on the front of the ladies' bar, which is the venue which I'll be giving my talk on Thursday. And I was out and about on Thursday doing a bit of shopping, and I thought to myself, let me pop in to Northerns and see if my poster is still there. Well, imagine my consternation when I walked in and the poster had been removed. Of course, I was concerned that maybe one of the committee members that had an objection to the poster being put up there. So I phoned Rod Skeepers to ask him what had happened, and he said that it had nothing to do with him and it was some petty and malicious individual from Benoni Northerns, presumably. Had another poster printed yesterday and I put it up in the main bar, and let's see what happens. So if you're available next Thursday, the 7th of December at 6:30, please feel free to pop in and pick up a book. I also set up a Facebook business page for my book, which is called Unbutchered, The Shocking True Story of Dr. Luke Gordon, but it's still a new page, so there are not many followers. So I'd encourage you to look it up and follow it, and then you'll be able to get updates on the forthcoming books and events at which I may be speaking. So the first excerpt from my first book, which you'll see here, is I'll start with the introduction. This is my story. I've been trying to write my memoir for several years now, and as with most memoirs, it's a tale of some high and many lows. With the advent of e-books such as Amazon, which play a significant role in everyone's life, a transformation has occurred through which people can tell their stories to millions without having to find a publisher for their books. Now, people seldom wish to read a story about a man or woman born into a wealthy family, growing up in a loving home and playing in the first team rugby, acing all their subjects with full distinctions, going to an Ivy League university, passing cum laude and then completing an MBA and becoming the CEO of a hugely successful company and retiring with lots of money and stuff and a high consumption, idyllic lifestyle. Rather, people are drawn to stories of people who've survived adversity. And we live in a strange world where 97% of the people are kind and good and wish only the best for their fellow man. Unfortunately, a tiny percentage are psychopaths or sociopaths and can adversely impact the lives of 97% of good people. Now, the prospect of writing a comprehensive memoir on my career has been quite daunting. And before the advent of the internet, I would have had to source a publisher and go complete the entire manuscript before submitting it to a publisher to have the book printed. Now, there are many stories of writers who've approached publishers and have received many, many rejection letters, and only the last gasp effort has found them a publisher who will run with them. Now, with the world moving as fast as it is, remarkable opportunities have opened up for people wishing to tell their stories, and I'm going to tell my story in a serialized fashion. In this way, I can drip my story into the world and hopefully a few people will find it interesting. If the feedback I receive is positive, it may well be that this is a story that the world wants to hear. Now, society perceives doctors as paragons of virtue, kindness, knowledge and wisdom, but in all professions they're bad eggs, and medicine is no exception, and it has its fair share of psychopaths. In his excellent book, The Psychopath Epidemic, Why the World is So Fucked Up and What You Can Do About It, by Cameron Riley, He cites the FBI's definition of a psychopath. Many psychopaths exhibit a profound lack of remorse for the aggressive actions, both violent and non-violent, along with the corresponding lack of empathy for victims. The central psychopathic concept enables them to act in a cold-blooded manner, using those around them as pawns to achieve goals and satisfy needs and desires, whether sexual, financial, physical, or emotional. Most psychopaths are grandiose, selfish, sensation seekers who lack a moral compass and a conscience, and go through life taking what they want. They do not accept responsibility for their actions and find a way to shift the blame to someone or something else. Riley expounds further. Reasonable people can do bad things from time to time. We can be cruel, insensitive, selfish, and thoughtless, but nature has imbued us with a degree of empathy. We feel remorse, guilt, regret when we hurt others. While we will all do horrible things from time to time, we don't go out of our way to do them, and we feel bad afterwards. Psychopaths, on the other hand, have no conscience. They don't feel bad, they feel like winners. Most of us have simple wants and needs. We just want to live our lives, fall in love, have children, get laid from time to time, be fed well and entertained, and one day die peacefully in the presence of the people we love. As Riley says, we can't sleep at night if we have to lie and cheat and steal and screw our way to the top. But psychopaths don't lose a wink of sleep. On the contrary, they sleep better, knowing that they are winning. Now, most people think of psychopaths as ranting dictators, mafia dons, or serial killers. They wouldn't dream of regarding their local priest, doctor, CEO, or attorney as a full-blown psychopaths. Psychiatrists estimate that psychopaths comprise about 1 to 4% of the adult population. Now, if this is the case, the global population would be in the region of 60 million. 60 million psychopaths. That's the entire population of South Africa. Let that sink in. The garage pie incident. One evening towards the end of September 2013, I was on my way back home, and I can't quite remember where I'd been. Still, I was feeling somewhat snackish, and typically at about 10 that night, having a bit too much to drink, my glucose levels were low, and I felt ravenous. My brain was craving carbohydrates, and I succumbed to the temptation of buying a piping hot garage pie and a Coke. I pulled into a corner BP garage close to where I lived, and as I walked past the newsstand where all the magazines and newspapers were displayed, something caught my eye, and it immediately filled me with horror. On the top shelf of the rack of newspapers was a copy of the Star newspaper, and with a photograph of me cloned from my Facebook page. And the picture took up at least half of the display, and with my mouth agape and in total disbelief, I read the glaring headline above the photograph: "Stop this butcher." My mind went completely numb, and I furtively looked around the shop to see if anyone would recognize me and start mumbling under their hands. I simply couldn't fathom that a sentient human being would craft such a cruel and demeaning headline with the intent of inflicting maximum humiliation on another human being. Everything was a blur after this, and I'm not even sure whether I got that garage pie and Coke. I scuttled out of the all-night store, and I got into my car and just sat staring into space, trying to make sense of it all. I didn't even buy a copy of the newspaper for fear that the cashier would recognize me. I knew that reading the vile diatribe in the article wouldn't alleviate my mental anguish I was already experiencing. It finally dawned on me that this was the first salvo of a shitstorm that had been brewing for many years. I'm unsure whether I had been deluding myself about the danger, or I was simply blissfully ignorant of what was coming. This was the beginning of a particularly vicious and vindictive media campaign. For the weeks and months that ensued after this episode, my mind was numb, and I still had to come to terms with the extreme malice from which this witch hunt emanated. I tried to get my mind off the bombshell that had been dropped, and one day, while I was traveling through Johannesburg to visit my children, My eyes happened to chance on a Star newspaper poster that was directly in my line of sight, and I couldn't help read the blazing headline, "Butcher List Grows." Every patient I had treated over the last 18 years who had expressed dissatisfaction with the operation came to mind. Were they all hopping on the bandwagon to bask in the limelight? I cringed with humiliation at the prospect of my children or siblings seeing these headlines splashed all over town. I've often seen colleagues from other specialities targeted by sensationalist tabloids like the Star newspaper, and I was perplexed at how a journalist could sit down behind a keyboard and trash a doctor with hateful and vile rhetoric. In some ways, I had a sense of complacency, thinking to myself that this would never happen to me. It would seem that second-rate journalists who end up working at tacky newspapers such as the Star relish the prospect of branding doctors with the most demeaning and humiliating labels. The zenith of a career of a journalist of this ilk is to be able to brand a surgeon as a butcher. This type of journalist dreams of covering a story in which they can pepper the article with the word botched. They have no regard for the fact that this doctor is a normal human being who has parents, grandparents, brothers and sisters, children and grandchildren. Their objective is to dehumanize that doctor in order to inflict maximum pain and humiliation with the intent of destroying their reputation. I recently found a movie on the story of Richard Jewell on Netflix. Now, he was a security guard who had alerted the Centennial Olympic Park bombing at the 1996 Summer Olympics in Atlanta. He was a simple, low-intelligence man, possibly a little bit irritating at times. If you watch the documentary, you'll see, but he bore no malice. He was initially hailed as a hero. He'd spotted the bomb and alerted the police, and as the crowd was being cleared, the bomb went off, but with far fewer casualties than if the public had not been removed from the scene. A particularly malicious reporter was grasping at straws to find some sensationalistic aspect to boost the sales of her newspaper, and she managed to get a snippet of the false information from one of the FBI officers and promptly went and splashed it all over the newspapers that Richard Jewell was in fact the person behind the bombing. The journalists walking into her office with her colleagues and were applauding her victory typifies her cruel and malicious motives. As the story unfolds, it becomes apparent that Richard Jewell had nothing to do with the bombing, and he had to bear a great deal of public ridicule and vilification before being completely exonerated. The journalist had done no research on the snippet of information she had received from the FBI agent. This brings me to the point of dehumanization. David Livingstone Smith is a philosopher with a particular interest in dehumanization and has written some excellent books on the subject, amongst others, Less Than Human, Why We Demean, Enslave and Exterminate Others, On Humanity, Dehumanization and How to Resist, and Making Monsters, the Uncanny Power of Dehumanization. Dehumanization is conceiving of others as subhumans. Smith mentions an interesting point from the psychological aspect in the form of dehumanization, and that is, what is it about the human mind that makes dehumanization possible? The idea of labeling a surgeon as a butcher is to create in the minds of the reader a monster that is dangerous and should be avoided at all costs, and indeed severely punished. The object of dehumanization, the surgeon, is seen as hazardous. This is typically seen when the media portray serial killers and Nazi war criminals as butchers, such as the SS functionary Josef Albert Meisinger, also known as the Butcher of Warsaw, and SS officer Klaus Barbie, who was also known as the Butcher of Lyon. The object of the exercise is to arouse moral indignation and horror in the public and to ensure that the object of the dehumanization is destroyed. Smith then further goes on to relate how governments, and in particular the Nazi regime, would hijack the press to portray the target of their dehumanization, namely the Jews and Gypsies, as caricatures in cartoons, where, for example, the head of a person with typical Jewish features would be transposed onto the body of a rat, with the implication that Jews are subhuman. Smith also relates the egregious racism of the American Deep South with victimization of blacks and the ubiquitous lynchings. The dehumanization process described blacks as apes or monkeys and not as humans. The focus of Smith's work is to highlight the dehumanization of races, where the origin of my dehumanization emanated from two professional men. Dehumanization is the product of propaganda. It results from people in positions of power who want us to do terrible things to one another. The most extreme example is that of genocide, in which people in positions of power wish to convince us to harm people because they are dangerous, toxic, and subhuman creatures that we must destroy. This overcomes a natural resistance we have to do to harm others. The dehumanizers are apt to use terminology which likens the target of dehumanization to a monster or animal. Dr. Smith states that no one is a monster, and being a Jew himself, he states unequivocally that Hitler was not a monster, and neither was Goebbels. They were human beings. He avers that it's not acceptable to label human beings as demons or monsters anymore. So the perpetrators of the dehumanizing propaganda utilize substitute terms. The targets of dehumanization are diseased, they're criminals, and they are dangerous and bad to the bone. The fallout of this frenzied media campaign and relentless onslaught with the abuse of the court processes, the hounding of the HPCSA resulted in me being suspended from practicing, pending the outcome of a disciplinary inquiry related to 16 complaints from patients that I'd received over a period of about 13 years. All but one of the complaints mysteriously appeared within the space of approximately 3 months. The circumstances and motives of how these complaints had been recruited is the subject of my serialized memoir. This type of journalism can almost be expected of tabloid newspapers because this is what tabloid journalists do. The object is not to find and reveal the truth. The object is to sensationalize headlines that sell newspapers. What makes this story so much more disturbing and appalling is that the instigators of the campaign were an attorney and a plastic surgeon. A considerable amount of time and money was sunk into the project in order to achieve the ultimate end, to destroy my reputation and to destroy my career. In this series of books, I'm going to tell my story and relate the story spanning many years that led up to this moment of a highly personal attack which was specifically intended to destroy me. I'll relate stories of how I came to be a doctor and ultimately why I decided to specialize as a plastic surgeon. Overlapping these stories are stories of the complaints of who were recruited, or complainants who were recruited as pawns as part of this witch hunt, and of course the sham hearings that were held at the Health Professions Council of South Africa. The bad actors are highly intelligent professionals, and I will show how brilliantly they managed to put a spin on the story and to create the impression of me being this grossly incompetent, heartless plastic surgeon, and then coming to the rescue of the victims that appeared at the HPCSA hearings. The incident that occasioned the hatching of this dastardly plan took place around 2004, and I was blissfully oblivious to the danger that I was in until it was too late. Just a reminder that I'll be doing a book launch at Benoni Northern's in the Ladies' Bar on the 7th of December at 6:30 in the evening. Please feel free to come and I will give a 20-minute or so talk. And this will be followed by a discussion, question and answer, and book signing. Also, just to remind you about the story of me putting up the poster at the event on Monday at Benoni Northern's Club. And when popping there on Thursday, the poster had been removed by some malicious person. It's quite incredible that 10 years after the fact, there are still people that have an axe to grind with me and are willing to interfere with my constitutional right to freedom of speech. Anyway, let's carry on. I'll give you an excerpt from book 2. Fatima and Ziad Murad were a pleasant Lebanese couple that I saw in the clinic's early days. Fatima had full lips, high cheekbones, and large, beautiful eyes. Ziad was a strapping young man who looked after himself with prominent pecs and deltoids and wore a sleeveless t-shirt to show off his chiseled body. Both Fatima and Ziad had typical attractive Mediterranean features. I had replaced Fatima's breast implants, and I did an unusual operation on Ziad, as he was one of the only 2 of these operations that I'd ever performed. I see nowadays it's actually quite a common procedure. They were pleasant and courteous. One morning I came in to start a morning consultation session, and Annette mentioned that the Murads had come in the previous afternoon wanting to see me. They came in for something trivial and were insistent on seeing me. My receptionist, Wendy, politely told them that they had come in and outside scheduled consulting hours to schedule an appointment the following morning. A heated argument ensued, resulting in them storming out of the reception in a huff. A few weeks later, Annette and I found ourselves in a hospital boardroom in Johannesburg with members of the Association of Plastic Surgeons Executive Committee. After a roundtable discussion, we concluded the meeting, and everybody conceded that the episode had been blown way out of proportion. Everybody stood up smiling, and we all went our separate ways. As Annette and I walked across the car park to our car to drive back to Benoni, we felt satisfied that we'd managed to dodge a bullet and that the Murads were happy. The terrible reality is that my fate was sealed. I was doomed. About 10 years later, I would experience the horrific fallout of what transpired in that meeting. I'm now going to jump ahead to chapter 6, where I expand on this story, and you can get a good idea of where the Murads, not their real names, fit in. About a year after we refurbished the house for our day clinic, a Lebanese couple named Fatima and Ziad Murad came to see me. They came to see me on the recommendation of another Lebanese patient and her husband with whom I was friends. Fatima wanted to revise a breast lift with new implants, which I often saw in my practice. Patients would come in and have a breast lift done and with the implant, and they'd be very happy in the first few weeks after the operation, and once the swelling settled down, they were once again frustrated because they liked the breasts when they were swollen. And this is what happens with hedonic adaptation. We predict that we'll be happier once we have more plastic surgery, until our minds have habituated to the current status quo. Now, Ziad was a bodybuilder. I didn't see a lot of male patients coming in for cosmetic surgery, and it was less than 5% of all patients seeking cosmetic surgery. Ziad had an unusual request: biceps implants. I thought his guns looked quite great, actually, and in the very early years of my practice, I'd been to a congress, and I distinctly remember the topic of biceps implants coming up. I remember a senior colleague by the name of Alistair Lamont saying there was a straightforward solution to enlarging biceps: put in calf implants. Dedicated biceps implants were not available in those days, which they are today. Once the dust had settled from the story I was about to tell, I asked Alistair whether he remembered telling this story at the Congress. He denied ever having said this, and the reason for his denial will become apparent when the story unfolds. Now, within a short time after attending that Congress, while I was still practicing at Sunwood Park Hospital, a gentleman in his 60s, a bodybuilder in his younger days, came to see me requesting biceps implants. Now, in my practice's early days, I was cavalier about taking on novel, new operations. However, as the years went by, the University of Hard Knocks trained me to become cautious about attempting new procedures. The safer route is to allow other plastic surgeons to make mistakes and then learn from them. The operation was successful, and the elderly gent was thrilled with his biceps implants. I told him it wasn't a standard operation when Ziad appeared with Fatima, but nevertheless he was happy to have the op done. I told him about the potential risks, the significant danger of being infection, and in the event of an infection being uncontrollable with antibiotics, the implant must be removed and then let the infection settle down and reinserted 6 months later. I gathered from the ostentatious car that Ziad and Fatima drove and their sort of fashionable clothing and threads that they were well heeled and money wasn't an object. I told them how each operation was performed and possible complications. I gave them quotes for each operation, and I was surprised when they both booked to have their operations done on the same day within a very, very short time. Now, as I write this chapter nearly 20 years later after the incident, my research on Google revealed that biceps augmentation or biceps implant with silicone has become very, very popular. Both of their operations went very well. I distinctly remember this couple for different reasons. About 10 days after the operation, Wendy, one of my receptionists, told me about an incident from the previous afternoon when Ziad and Fatima had come to see me because they were unhappy about something. Wendy explained to them that I was not in, and besides which it was outside regular consulting sessions. There appeared to be little urgency for them to see me. It wasn't an emergency, and if there was anything suspicious of a complication, Wendy would have phoned me and to fill me in on the story and whether I should come in and see the patient. Now, my threshold for seeing a patient was very low, as I would rather come in for something minor than miss a disaster. Wendy didn't phone me in this case, so to this day, I don't know what transpired that afternoon. Apparently, the conversation became really heated as Wendy was uncompromising about the need to call me. Although in hindsight, it probably would have been a better option, but it culminated with them storming out in a huff. When Wendy told me the story the following morning, she said she would have been happy to schedule for the next consultation session, which happened to be that morning. Still, they were piqued and opted not to return. I next received a call from Dr. Leslie Berkowitz, the Ombudsman for the Association of Plastic Surgeons in the Johannesburg region. Now, the function of an ombudsman is to act as a mediator in instances where patients have a gripe about their plastic surgeons, provided the surgeons are a member of the association. This role requires a great deal of tact and diplomacy, and to act in the role of an ombudsman because the objective is to pour oil on troubled waters and to mediate and to avert a lawsuit or a complaint to the HPCSA. Now, Berkowitz was renowned for his abrasive and cantankerous manner. You will recall in the earlier story about Berkowitz having to be escorted from the room to prevent him being beaten up by his peers. I'd heard many mutterings amongst my colleagues about how, rather than soothing a volatile situation with a pissed-off patient, he would inflame the problem and encourage them to complain to the HPCSA or to sue the plastic surgeon. I was in the clinic's kitchen having a bite to eat just before my afternoon sessions were scheduled. "Can you take a call from Dr. Berkowitz, doctor?" Wendy said from the reception area. "Sure, put it through to my office. I'll take it there," I replied. The phone rang, and as I walked into my office, I picked it up. "Hi, Les," I said in a friendly tone. There were no formalities or niceties in how he started the conversation. He told me that Fatima and Ziad had come to see him because of the incident with Wendy, and he barked at me in a grumpy and irritated voice. "I think you'd better come and see me," he said. "Things are happening in your practice which, if they don't stop, I will not be able to prevent it from going to the HPCSA. Ziad had developed an infection in his biceps. "What were you doing inserting a calf implant into biceps?" he barked at me. I was gobsmacked and mouthing my disbelief at being dressed down by a colleague as if I was a recalcitrant schoolboy guilty of a serious offense. I felt as if I'd been summoned to his office for a caning. Okay, Les, so how about Monday afternoon? I was struggling to make sense of this, what was unfolding. I'll give you a shout on Monday to confirm and get directions. And I said feebly, and I heard an impatient retort on the other side, and the line went dead. As I put down the phone, I felt this rage rising in my chest. My amygdala, the brain center responsible for arousing feelings of outrage in response to a threat in the environment, was firing furiously. I was upset by what happened, and I was distracted the whole afternoon while consulting patients. There's something delicious about rage, but it's a toxic and dangerous emotion, as evidenced by the crimes of anger, passion, and road rage indeed. I discussed the incident with Annette, and she was equally incensed. With the benefit of hindsight, it probably would have been prudent to observe the adage, discretion is the better part of valor. By the next day, my anger had subsided slightly, and rather than pick up the phone and confront Berkowitz, I crafted an email to the president of the association, Dr. Martin Kelly. So that's the excerpts I'm going to leave you with today. And I just want to remind you that please feel free to come along on Thursday to my book launch and book signing. Books will be on sale as well. We'll offer them at a nicely discounted price, and it'll be great to see you there. And with that, I'm going to conclude this Facebook presentation. I hope to do more of these. If you enjoyed them, comment on them, and next time I'll give you some advance notice about the next Facebook Live presentation. So this is just an experiment. I'm just finding my feet with the whole Facebook Live presentation. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.